On January 27, 2013, students from the Federal University of Santa Maria hosted a party at the Kiss Nightclub in Santa Maria, Brazil. The event, intended to celebrate the start of the new school year, drew over 1,000 attendees, including both students and locals. What was meant to be a joyful night of celebration, however, would tragically turn into a devastating disaster. During the set of a band performing at the venue that night called Gurizada Fandaguera, lead singer Marcelo Santos activated a spark machine, something the band frequently incorporated into their performances to enhance the atmosphere. Photos taken inside the club that night captured the exact moment the sparks began to fly. While the use of spark machines and fire was a regular part of the band's shows, this time it would lead to devastating consequences. The sparks from the machine ignited the highly flammable acoustic foam panels lining the ceiling of the club. Within moments, a raging fire engulfed the venue. The sudden outbreak caused mass panic, triggering a stampede as people desperately tried to escape. Firefighters arrived quickly, but by the time they reached the scene, the fire had already claimed many lives. The intensity of the flames, combined with the rapid spread of smoke, made survival nearly impossible for those trapped inside. In total, 242 people lost their lives and over 600 others were injured, marking it as one of the deadliest fires in Brazil's history. Following the tragedy, the victims' families and the broader public demanded answers about how such a catastrophic fire could have broken out so quickly. Investigations later revealed that the club's owners, Alessandro Spor and Mauro Hoffman, had failed to follow basic safety protocols. Spark machines were not authorized for use in the club, and the venue lacked a sufficient number of emergency exits for its capacity. As a result, both owners were found guilty of manslaughter. Alessandro Spor was sentenced to 22 years in prison, while Mauro Hoffman received a 19-year sentence. Marcelo Santos, the man responsible for igniting the fire, was also charged with manslaughter and sentenced to 18 years in prison, along with another band member. Rajiv Gandhi was an Indian politician who became the country's youngest prime minister at the age of 40 in 1984, following the assassination of his mother, Indira Gandhi, India's first and, to date, only female prime minister. During his 5 years in office, he was credited with initiating several economic reforms, including increasing government support for science and technology industries. However, his time in office was not without its challenges, as he became involved in numerous scandals, making him a target for several assassination plots and attempts. While he managed to leave office unscathed in 1989, the danger that surrounded him was far from over. On May 21, 1991, Rajiv Gandhi was in Sri Perumbudur, a town in India's southernmost state, campaigning for re-election as Prime Minister. During a campaign event, this photo was taken, showing Gandhi speaking to the crowd. It would be the last photo of him alive. In the bottom left of this image is 22-year-old Thanmozi Rajaratnam, a member of a militant organization. Just seconds after this photo was taken, Rajaratnam detonated an explosive device concealed under her dress, killing herself, Gandhi, and over a dozen others instantly. Among those who lost their lives was the photographer who captured the final image of Gandhi. Following the death of Rajiv Gandhi, the militant organization known as the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam claimed responsibility for the assassination. Their reasoning was revenge, stating that Gandhi's policies and actions had led to the deaths of many Tamil people across India. In the aftermath of his death, the final photo of Gandhi gained widespread recognition, both in India and around the world. The image serves as an eerie portrayal of the final moments before disaster. On October 12, 1972, an amateur rugby team from Montevideo, Uruguay, was set to travel to Santiago, Chile, to play a match against an English team. To make the journey, the team chartered a flight aboard Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, with friends and relatives filling extra seats as additional passengers. In total, 45 people were aboard the plane when it departed from Carrasco International Airport in Uruguay. During the flight, this photo was taken, showing team members chatting and appearing in high spirits. Tragically, it would be the last photo ever taken of them as a team. Due to a storm, the plane was forced to land in Mendoza, Argentina, where the team stayed overnight. The following afternoon, the plane resumed its journey toward Santiago. Although the storm had passed, the weather conditions were still far from ideal. Under normal circumstances, this might not have been a major issue, but the route to Santiago crossed the Andes mountain range, a notoriously challenging area to navigate, particularly in poor weather. These factors would ultimately lead to fatal consequences. Navigating through clouds and strong winds, pilot Julio Cesar Ferradas miscalculated the plane's descent point, leading to a fatal error. At approximately 3:30 p.m. on October 13th, the plane struck a mountain peak, losing both wings and its tail on impact. The front section of the aircraft then slid down the mountain before coming to rest in a valley at an altitude of approximately 11,500 feet. The crash killed 12 people instantly and left the remaining 33 passengers stranded in a harsh alpine wilderness, facing sub-zero temperatures with minimal supplies and no way to call for help. The Chilean Air Search and Rescue Service was alerted within an hour that the flight was unaccounted for and launched a search operation. However, the snow-covered peaks made detecting the white plane nearly impossible. As a result, the survivors were left to fend for themselves, repurposing the damaged fuselage into a crude shelter to endure the freezing night. 5 more passengers, already weakened by injuries from the crash, succumbed to the cold and lost their lives during the first night on the mountain. The next morning, the remaining group of 28 held out hope that rescue was imminent, but this hope would soon fade. Throughout the day, 11 planes from Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay conducted extensive searches over the mountainous terrain, but none were able to locate the crash site. On several occasions, the survivors spotted rescue planes flying overhead and signaled desperately, but the pilots, unable to see the wreckage camouflaged by the snow, flew on without noticing them. By October 21st, after more than 140 hours of searching, authorities concluded that it was impossible for anyone to have survived in such harsh conditions for so long, so the search was ended. They were wrong. The surviving passengers managed to endure the first week by rationing the small amount of food they had brought on the plane, but the meager supply soon ran out. Trapped in one of the most remote regions of the Andes, with no animals or vegetation in sight, they were forced to make an unimaginable decision. To survive, they resorted to cannibalism, using the frozen bodies of their deceased friends and family as sustenance. Although they believed this would only be a temporary measure to stay alive until rescue arrived, it would ultimately last for weeks, and then months. By December 12th, 60 days after the crash, the site had still not been located, and only 16 passengers remained alive. In a desperate bid for survival, 3 members, Roberto Canessa, Fernando Parado, and Antonio Vizintin, gathered supplies and set out to hike across the mountains to reach civilization in Chile. Antonio eventually returned to camp, but Roberto and Fernando pressed on. They continued for 10 days through the unforgiving terrain. At last, they encountered Sergio Catalan, a Chilean shepherd who often traveled in the Andes. Sergio quickly alerted authorities, and within a day, help was on the way. On December 23rd, after an astounding 72 days in the harsh and unrelenting Andes Mountains, the survivors were finally rescued and returned to their families. John Lennon was an English musician who gained worldwide fame in the 1960s as a founding member of the legendary band, The Beatles. As a singer, songwriter, and peace activist, Lennon left a lasting impact on music and popular culture, inspiring millions worldwide. His successful career also brought him immense wealth, with a lifetime net worth of $200 million, equivalent to approximately $700 million today. Although his message was one of peace, Lennon's life tragically came to a violent end at the age of 40. On the evening of December 8, 1980, John Lennon was leaving his residence at the Dakota apartment building in New York when he encountered photographer Paul Gorish. a devoted Beatles fan who often waited outside hoping to see him. On this particular night, another man, Mark David Chapman, was also waiting outside. As Lennon emerged, Chapman approached him and asked for an autograph on his copy of Double Fantasy, Lennon's latest album. Gorish captured the moment Lennon signed the album, with Chapman visible in the background. This photo would become one of the last ever taken of John Lennon alive. At around 10:50 p.m. that night, John Lennon and his wife Yoko Ono returned to the Dakota, planning to say goodnight to their son before heading out to the Stage Deli restaurant. As they exited their limousine and approached the building, they walked past Mark David Chapman, who was still lingering outside. Without warning, Chapman pulled a revolver from his coat pocket and fired 5 shots at Lennon. After the shooting, Chapman calmly removed his coat to reveal that he was not carrying any concealed weapons and remained at the scene, waiting for police. Police arrived on the scene within minutes of the shooting and found Mark David Chapman calmly reading a paperback copy of The Catcher in the Rye. He was promptly arrested and, in a bizarre moment, apologized to the officers for ruining their night. Meanwhile, John Lennon was rushed to the hospital in a desperate attempt to save his life. Despite the doctor's best efforts, he had lost too much blood and was pronounced dead shortly after 11 p.m. Following the incident, news of John Lennon's death rapidly spread across the globe. The question on everyone's mind was, why did Mark David Chapman want to take Lennon's life? It was soon revealed that Chapman had been a longtime fan of the Beatles, but had grown resentful of Lennon in his later years, particularly due to some of Lennon's public comments and lyrics. Chapman was reportedly infuriated by Lennon's 1971 song Imagine, in which Lennon sang about a world without possessions or materialism. In a later prison interview, Chapman stated, "He told us to imagine no possessions, and there he was, with millions of dollars, and yachts, and farms, and country estates, laughing at people like me who had believed the lies, and bought the records, and built a big part of their lives around his music." Driven by his growing grievances with Lennon, Chapman meticulously planned the murder for months before carrying it out. John Lennon's death profoundly impacted music and culture, with vigils, tributes, and memorials continuing to honor his life and legacy to this day. Mark David Chapman was sentenced to 20 years to life for the murder, along with mandatory psychiatric treatment during his incarceration. Despite becoming eligible for parole in 2000, he has been denied 13 times and remains in prison, with his next parole hearing scheduled for 2025. In the aftermath of Lennon's death, Paul Gorish's photo gained worldwide notoriety. There is an unmistakable eeriness to the photo, capturing Lennon alongside the very man who would end his life in cold blood just hours later. On January 19, 1973, an American expedition of 10 climbers set out to conquer Mount Aconcagua in Argentina, the tallest peak in the Western Hemisphere, standing at over 22,000 feet. After arriving in Argentina, the group embarked on a 2-day journey to the base camp, situated at approximately 14,000 feet. In the days that followed, as the climbers ascended higher, altitude sickness and exhaustion began to take their toll. Although the team had planned to stop at several campsites on their way to the summit, some were forced to return to base camp due to illness or other challenges. Ultimately, only 4 members, John Cooper, Janet Johnson, Bill Zeller, and Arnold McMillan, managed to reach the 3rd campsite and prepare for the final ascent. Unfortunately, they would never make it to the top. The 4 remaining climbers ascended to 21,000 feet, where they decided to stop for the night and dig a small snow cave on the glacier to sleep. The following morning, John Cooper informed the group that he was too fatigued to continue and would be heading back down to Camp 3. The descent was approximately 2 hours, and John appeared alert, so the group allowed him to go alone, despite this generally being ill-advised. After John's departure, Bill, Arnold, and Janet resumed their climb further up the mountain. As the 3 climbers neared the summit, the snow became waist-deep, forcing Bill and Arnold to take turns breaking the trail for an easier ascent, while Janet stayed behind. When they turned back toward Janet after clearing a path, she was nowhere to be seen. They eventually found her about 100 feet off the trail, lying in the snow in a delirious state. Bill roped himself to Janet to keep them together, and since it was now dark, the group was forced to spend another night on the mountain. The following morning, the group began their descent, but Janet was unable to stand, and her hands were swollen and blackened from frostbite. With Bill and Janet tied together, Arnold decided to descend to Camp 3 alone, as he had begun to experience hallucinations from the altitude. On his way back to camp, Arnold fell and slid 1,000 feet down the mountain, sustaining a black eye, but managing to continue. During his descent, Arnold hallucinated what appeared to be a dead soldier lying in the snow. He would later come to find out that what he had actually seen was the body of John Cooper. In the meantime, Bill and Janet continued their descent, but they too suffered a hard fall that caused them to become separated. As Bill made his way back toward Janet, he stumbled upon John Cooper's frozen body. After reuniting with Janet, Bill told her he would return to Camp 3 alone to inform Arnold about Cooper's death. Since they were close enough to camp to see the tents and Janet's condition seemed to have improved by that point, Bill believed it was safe for Janet to make her own way back to camp. Unfortunately, Bill would be the last person to ever see her alive. Bill arrived at camp a few hours after Arnold, and the two went to sleep, expecting Janet to meet them there. However, when they awoke the next morning, there was no sign of her. They immediately knew that her failure to return to camp almost certainly meant she had passed away. With their supplies dwindling, they decided it was best to descend the mountain and alert authorities rather than search for her themselves. Word quickly reached the families of John and Janet, and since Bill and Arnold were the last people to see them alive, both men were questioned by police. Their accounts of events contained slight discrepancies, raising suspicions among authorities and leading some in the public to speculate that they may have been involved in John and Janet's death. However, there was no concrete evidence to suggest foul play. The harsh conditions of the mountain made it far more likely that both had succumbed to altitude sickness and hypothermia. Complicating matters further, the remote and inaccessible location of their bodies prevented authorities from retrieving them for an extended period. When John and Janet's remains were finally recovered, it only deepened the mystery surrounding their fates. In late 1973, a four-man team was dispatched to search for John and Janet. They managed to locate only John, whose body was frozen solid, with what was described as a look of terror on his face. When his remains were brought down the mountain and examined more closely, an unsettling discovery was made. John had a deep, cylindrical wound in his abdomen. Initially, investigators suspected he might have fallen on his ice axe during the climb, but the axe was not found near his body. Moreover, experts who examined the wound questioned whether an ice axe could have caused such a precise injury by accident. Despite these doubts, police never suspected foul play. John's full autopsy report was sealed by a judge, but the coroner ruled that he had died of brain injuries, and his abdominal wound was not investigated further. At his family's request, John's body was later flown back to Kansas, where he was subsequently buried. Janet's body wasn't found until 1975, when three local men familiar with the 1973 expedition decided to search for her. Despite her face being blackened from 2 years of exposure, they noticed she had sustained severe injuries to her face. This immediately raised questions, as the slope where she was found was gentle, making it unlikely she could have fallen hard enough to cause such injuries. Even more puzzling, her clothes showed no signs of tearing. If she had fallen hard enough for the impact to potentially end her life, it logically follows that her clothes would have been torn as well. Adding to the mystery, a rock was found sitting on top of Janet's body in a way that suggested it had been deliberately placed there. Since the men were not equipped to recover Janet's body, it remained on the mountain for nearly a year before it was finally retrieved and brought in for an autopsy. Like John, her official cause of death was listed as a brain injury. However, medical assistant Daniel Araujo, who assisted the coroner during the autopsies of both John and Janet, insisted their deaths were not accidental. In a later interview, he stated they were killed, both of them. These kind of injuries were not self-inflicted. Janet was later buried at a cemetery near the trailheads of Aconcagua. Although the case remains shrouded in mystery, a major development surfaced decades after the expedition. In February 2020, climbers on Aconcagua discovered a camera near the location where Janet's body had been found. Recognizing Janet's name, they brought the camera down and contacted the New York Times. Arrangements were soon made to send the camera to Greg Miller, an expert in recovering damaged film. Thanks to the freezing temperatures and low humidity of the Andes, the rolls of film inside had been perfectly preserved for nearly half a century. Upon developing the film, Miller uncovered dozens of photos from the ill-fated expedition, including the last known images of both John Cooper and Janet Johnson. The discovery reignited public interest in the case, which had long faded from attention. People marveled at the pristine quality of the photos, especially considering they had endured 47 years of exposure on a freezing mountainside. While the photos did not reveal new clues about what had happened to John and Janet, there is an eerie quality to them, serving as a haunting time capsule of an expedition that ended in tragedy.